I'm delighted to be joined by Matt Hexter, co-host of the excellent Hiraeth Welsh Politics podcast. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Anoosh.
In Wales, the big political story at the moment, as is the case across the UK, is the state of the health service. So, Matt, do you want to start off by just giving us an overview of the state of the NHS in Wales?
I think it's very clear that there are concerns about the NHS in Wales, but there are concerns about the NHS across the country. The stories that you have just talked about, Anoosh, are sort of indicative of wider concerns across the NHS in Wales. Social care, as you said, is a huge issue, whether that be now that people are being discharged out of hospital without a social care plan, or more importantly, perhaps the fact that the absence of a functioning social care system across the UK means that more people are staying in hospital who could be discharged from those beds if social care plans are available. I think we've also seen in the last few weeks that many health boards across Wales are saying to people they shouldn't go to their A&E unless there is a life-threatening condition. And I think, of course, that is very worrying, but I think it has to be couched in the sort of devolved context to explain why the situation is potentially so bad in Wales. And I think, obviously, whilst the Senedd does have responsibility for the NHS and paying conditions, the full range of economic levers that are available in Westminster or even in Holyrood are not available to Cardiff Bay, which means that they're not in the economic position with which they would be able to sort of improve the situation beyond what it currently is. The Welsh NHS budget is already half of the Welsh Government's budget. So it's very difficult to see where additional funding can come from for this, unless more money is spent in Westminster that can increase the Welsh Government's budget through binding consequentials.
That's really interesting. Let's talk a bit more about that, because Rishi Sunak has brought up the Welsh Government's predicament with the NHS in PMQs. I'm sure you've seen. Clearly, he thinks this is a sort of weak point for Keir Starmer to get him on. In Labour-run Wales, the situation is like this. Why isn't Labour doing more to help patients in Wales? That kind of attack line. Health is a devolved policy matter. And so, there is a degree of responsibility from the Welsh Government there. But what you're saying is their hands are actually tied. Where does the balance lie? How much can Mark Drakeford use that line of argument before he simply starts looking weak?
In Westminster, the Welsh NHS has long been used as a weapon against Labour, from David Cameron calling Office Dyke the line between life and death, to various Conservative PMs focusing on the fact that the Welsh Government are the only government in the history of the UK to decrease NHS funding. However, as with many exchanges in Westminster, the content of debate and the question sessions are focused usually on quick barbs and winning duels rather than providing any sort of helpful context to the debate. So it's always important to remember the very limited economic levers available to the Welsh Government, and because it does remain in the main Westminster which holds Wales's purse strings. So in terms of tax, because it's a very easy one to understand.
Yeah.
In Wales, we can vary our tax rates. So we could add, say, an extra penny onto the pound in income tax. But we don't have any control over the tax thresholds. We've seen in Scotland where they've altered the bands to say that this particular group of earners should pay more. In Wales, we don't have that power. We'd have to operate within the existing bands as provided to us by the UK government. In the context of those tax bands, if you put an extra 1 penny on the pound on the base rate of tax in Wales, you'd raise an additional 220, 230 million. If you put an extra penny on the higher rate, you'd raise around £30 million. And then on the additional rate, between £3 and £5 million in addition, because Wales doesn't have a very big high additional rate of taxpayers. Whilst that sounds like a lot to me or you, in governmental terms, it's not that much. And also, in the context of pay rises, which is one of the massive things that has caused so much pressure on the NHS, the fact that we're seeing increased industrial action, for every 1% of additional pay you give to a public sector worker in Wales, that will cost you £100 million. And I think it doesn't take a genius to work out that what people in the public sector are calling for, and that additional money, it doesn't go very far. And that is also, when you consider you'd have to spend some of that additional money on frontline services.
Right. Okay. Because, of course, and you mentioned it there have been strikes among NHS workers in Wales as well as in England. This means that basically Mark Drakeford and the Welsh Government is not able to give those workers what they want. Is there an appreciation that there are limits on what they can do within the sort of devolved structure of the UK, or is there as much anger and disappointment in the Labour-run government there as there appears to be in England among health workers and indeed the public regarding the nurses' strikes and the refusal to negotiate?
I mean, there are concerns about public services here, as there are in other parts of the UK. However, unfortunately, Wales doesn't really have the same level of political news coverage as England, and nor does it have the same sort of level of Devo literacy amongst the general population as you may see in Scotland. I mean, that increased during the pandemic. Knowledge of which government was responsible for what increased, and the nuances of how things are funded and who was responsible for things such as paying conditions isn't necessarily widely understood. And additionally, in Wales, there is a tendency for people to attribute good things to the Welsh government, even when it happens in a non-devolved area. And similarly, there's a tendency for bad things to be attributed to the UK government, even when it does occur in a devolved area. So, you can argue there's sort of an accountability deficit, which isn't good for Welsh democracy. But politically, that doesn't seem to be having much of an impact on the Welsh government. As seen in recent Senedd polls, it shows that Welsh Labour have their largest lead for over a decade.
Right, interesting. Okay, because you've just been explaining very eloquently and very clearly, the way that it's structured. But these kind of discussions about Barnett consequentials, etc., they're difficult for Labour politicians to make in a soundbite. And you were talking about that kind of, the barbs and the duelling in Westminster. It's difficult for politicians, even in Parliament in Westminster, to make those kind of arguments when they're being attacked along those lines. You used to work as a staffer for some Welsh Labour politicians. I hope you don't mind me mentioning that. How do Labour politicians make those kind of arguments in a way that the public can quickly understand without getting too much into the weeds of trying to explain devolution and how it works?
I think that the concept of austerity is now well understood. And
Mm.
for a long time in Wales, the understanding has been that we are underfunded by the UK government. And I think that has seeped through to most people. Most people do understand that the public realm has been underfunded by the UK government. If that's your particular political opinion, anyway, you may think that what the UK government is doing is responsible, etc. But I think that most people do understand that although the Welsh government is responsible for funding the Welsh NHS, that the Welsh government's funding is still controlled by the UK government. And I think most people don't understand necessarily how the tax raising system works in the devolved context, so they're not necessarily calling on the Welsh government to increase taxes. And I think that at the moment, with the cost of living crisis, they're unlikely to make that call.
Right, okay, but it's of course an argument that the SNP can use because they are going to raise taxes in Scotland on higher earners to boost spending on health and social care, and it's an argument they can use against Labour. Why aren't you doing this in Wales? You've explained, very clearly why it's a different situation, but does it not eventually make Mark Drakeford look weak, not using the levers that are available to him?
It's very difficult, Anoosh, because I think that Mark Drakeford has, for a long time, been seen to be reticent to use those tax-raising powers. He recently revealed in an interview that if Liz Truss's plan to drop the penny off the rate and get rid of the additional rate of tax, he probably would have used Welsh powers to raise that back up to where it was. But he's long been reticent to use these powers. And I think because of how poorly they are constructed compared to the Scottish powers, it is very difficult to use them. They're a bit of a blunt instrument. Because of how close we are to England, it would become a really big political issue. What happens if you work in Bristol and live in Wales and vice versa? Where do you pay your tax? How do you move that money across the border? Also, whilst the tax rates are being constructed in the way they are, they're a huge political weapon. So the Conservatives will use that, both sides of the border. In Wales, tax is never, even though we've had these powers for that time now, it's never really been an election issue. The Welsh Conservatives haven't really talked about dropping the Welsh rates of tax. And I think that if as soon as that power is used, it becomes a live political issue here, one that will be used by Welsh Conservatives against the UK, against the Welsh government, but also by the UK government against the Labour Party in Westminster.
Despite this dilemma, you mentioned earlier in the interview that Welsh Labour are high up in the polls. I mean, is this a failure of the opposition parties in Wales, or is it a sign of Welsh Labour's strength?
A little column A, a little column B. Um, I don't know to what extent your listeners know, but obviously Plaid Cymru entered into a cooperation agreement with the Welsh Government, and that has sort of nullified the potency of their opposition. We've been talking about health. Health is not covered within the scope of that agreement necessarily between Labour and Plaid Cymru. Social care is to a different degree. But I think the general economic landscape has made them less willing to attack Welsh Labour in health, and has made them less willing to call on funds to be reallocated from other departments towards doing that, because they have their agreed areas where they've made deals with the Welsh Government and they want to see that money spent there. And I think the Conservatives have been focusing on the NHS in Wales for a very long time, but it's very hard to get cut through for the Welsh Conservatives, whilst the UK government in Westminster is perceived to be poorly. The opposition hasn't been as strong as it could be, but I think that Welsh Labour do have a winning formula in Wales. I think we've recently seen Welsh Labour celebrate 100 years of electoral dominance in Wales, 100 years of being the largest party. They are the most dominant party in the democratic world, and if I had to put money on it, I'd say that they'd probably get to another 100 years of dominance in Wales too. And I don't think that's necessarily being arrogant. I think the Welsh Labour Party have been able to adapt to change and make themselves reflective of Wales. Behind my head, the phrase clear red water. They've been able to ensure that it's perfectly possible to be proudly Welsh and proudly Labour at the same time. They haven't, as Labour did in Scotland and arguably also in England, sacrificed the flag. Clear red water has come to mean so much more than what it did at the time, this rejection of UK Labour's choice-based agenda. Now it means in Wales you could vote Labour not only because they're left-wing, but because they're also quintessentially Welsh. And I think that Welsh Labour's ability to encapsulate that mood of the nation means that they are in an incredibly strong position and will continue to be for the foreseeable future.
And when you put it like that, it does really make you think about Keir Starmer's Labour and Labour in Scotland, perhaps to a slightly lesser extent. But have they learnt those lessons from Welsh Labour's identity and brand? Even, I know it's a glib way of putting it, but you do feel as if they've got quite an impressive formula in Wales that they haven't quite managed to grasp in England. Obviously, Labour are doing much better in the polls across the country, but there is still this slight tension in the Labour Party in England about sort of being a patriotic party, but as well as being a progressive party, that I don't think they've quite managed to nail yet, even though that is sort of one of their priorities.
Yeah, I think it's very hard. I think that the British left has been less willing for a long time to embrace this idea of progressive patriotism. I think someone said that many years ago, than we have in Wales. I think in Wales we are much more comfortable with the idea of socialism and not nationalism, but certainly being proud of the country you seek to run are ideas that fit much more neatly together in the eyes of a Welsh left-wing person than necessarily they have done in the eyes of the British left for a long time. And I think that Keir Starmer has done a lot of good work in terms of making Labour more closely attributed to the Union flag. I think that there possibly needs to be more work to boil down into what exactly that means and how the Labour Party can find the right balance that the Welsh Labour Party have done, making people feel proud to be British in the same way that people in Wales feel proud to be Welsh, but also proud to back a progressive party. So I think there's more work to be done in the UK sense of exactly how that works in practice. And I think also, Anoosh, one of the things that we in Wales for a long time have discussed in terms of the UK Labour Party is, and John Denham has done lots of work on this, is the idea of an English Labour Party. And I think that the UK Labour Party could do a lot of good work in the space of trying to make themselves feel at the same time they can be a Labour Party for the whole UK, but specifically at the moment, given the purview of what they're responsible for, and respecting their sister parties in Scotland and Wales, that they also can be a good English Labour Party at the same time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just lastly, looking ahead towards a potential next general election, You mentioned that you think that Welsh Labour's sort of electoral success will continue riding high in Senate elections. How about in the next general election? Obviously, the Conservatives made inroads in what we sort of very simplistically call the Red Wall in 2019. Will the Red Wall of Wales be sort of rejecting the Tories next time round, do you think? I know it's unfair to ask for predictions, but what's your sense of of how politics is shifting in those kind of areas?
On Hiraeth, we have a big klaxon noise that goes off every time anyone makes a prediction. It's a really good
Well,
way.
you're klaxon free here. This is safe space.
It's difficult, I think, because obviously we'll have very different boundaries in Wales. For those of you who are listening who don't know, Wales will go down from 40 Westminster seats to 32. But on the current polling, it does look like Labour will do very well in Wales. I can see a significant number of those North Wales seats that were lost to the Conservatives going back to Labour. Obviously, there's also Ynys Môn in Anglesey in North Wales, which was won by the Conservatives last time. This time you've got Rhun ap Iorwerth from Plaid Cymru, who'll be standing in that seat, who's the current MS for that constituency, very popular. So whilst you would usually expect that in a big Labour swing, that seat may go back to Labour. It could go Plaid this time. Lots of unique little local battles like that. But I mean, on current polling, there's only one seat in Wales that Labour has never hold. That's Montgomeryshire. And even on current polling, some polls have Labour winning Montgomeryshire, but I don't see that happening necessarily. But with the current swings you're seeing, yeah, I would definitely imagine that whilst I wouldn't expect a sort of 97 level Conservative free Wales, I'd certainly see fewer Conservatives in Wales, well, being represented in Westminster in Welsh constituencies than we have at the moment.
Interesting. Okay, well, we'll keep an eye on that. Thanks so much, Matt. It was great having you on, and hopefully we'll speak to you again at some point.
Thank you very much, Anoosh.
If you like this video, then you can watch more clips from the New Statesman podcast on our YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe and click on the link on the screen.